And one of the things that I'll point out is, well, before I do, tomorrow you're going to do more of a warm-up on the kind of keys to winning an election, running a campaign. So what's the #1 rule? I'm going to ask you that tomorrow.
Simplicity. Simple.
Simplicity. Keep it simple. Take something complex and make it simple, right? You know, what's the simplest thing that you can do? Like, this is more important than policy in a lot of ways, ideology in certain ways. What's the greatest simplifying factor when we're looking at an election and a candidate? Likability. That's the simplest of constructs, right? What were you adding?
Tell the story.
Yeah, and I wanted to incorporate that. Both are correct answers. You have to have this likable candidate, and often what you do is you frame it up as like a story. Again, they're the hero. You have a protagonist and an antagonist. You have some sort of crisis or issue, and then they are the resolution. They're the ones that are going to fix it. So that video that we played really kind of, you know, synthesizes those two ideas. I need a likable candidate and a simple kind of story about hope or fear. Those seem to be the most simple constructs, right? So we kind of just gave you, I think, some superficial things, but, you know, obviously you'd want to be able to illustrate beyond like likability and candidate appeal. But we gave you some ideas about what's likable. You know, I think you guys can delve a little deeper on that. But again, I guess it's superficial. I did a superficial coverage because it is superficial, right? You know, it's Hayden. We like him. He was a general, and he helped win a war. We have a low bar for what we're looking for.
I think the part that gets me is that he's good enough.
He's good enough. We talked about policy mattering, but it's really hard for it to line up. You know, does issue voting take place? Well, I got to get a lot of planets aligned in terms of you have to be informed, the candidates have to have clear stances, your issues and their issues have to kind of align. If there's 8 issues that you're concerned with, does this candidate also share the same 8 views? There's a lot of things that have to line up, but what can we look at and see as a more simple form of issue voting? There's kind of 2 forms of issue voting that...
Is it the straight party ticket and the
Yep.
split party ticket?
So if I vote party line, that's me using party as a kind of a simple construct to kind of help me through the complexity of voting. I'm voting for, I'm using party, and that means I'm kind of voting on issues. I'm just using their cues. What's another type of voting where you're voting on issues? Yeah, Paul.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Not repeating the name of it, but it's when you don't choose, you don't just go down party lines.
So you're contrasting the 2 types of voting, and so the split party ticket would not necessarily be using party.
It'd be more on your personal issues and personal beliefs.
Right. So maybe that's a form of issue voting. But what's another kind of, instead of voting kind of on party line, you know, I've got 2 candidates. I want to, this is an example potentially of issue voting. So when I have 2 candidates, typically I have a challenger and an incumbent. How would incumbents, you know, voting for the incumbent be a form of issue voting?
You like the status quo?
Well, yeah. So one, I'm kind of saying this is a kind of a referendum on the job that they've done. But what have they done? What can I go in? Go ahead.
They've fixed so when they've been in office, they've fixed issues and they've taken an approach to things that I like. So I'm going to vote for them again.
So they have taken a position on hundreds of issues, and they've got all kinds of votes that are kind of a physical track record of it, right? So those are kind of the 2 forms of kind of issue voting that arguably kind of give you a shortcut to, you know, the more complex forms. Now, one of the things I was talking about too is that another major factor in winning elections is running a kind of a scientific, you know, thoughtful campaign here. Look at the numbers. 1/3 to half the voters make up their mind during the campaigns. A lot of us kind of, you know, again, identify with a political party. So what you see is 29% of the American public identifies as Democratic and 26% identify Republican. And then you've got a larger pool of independents, of people that are, you know, either unenrolled or unaffiliated. That's a big number. That might be surprising, you know, thinking that it almost, it's not quite double, but you know, it looks like it's double, right? what you gotta remember though is that those independents lean. And more often than not, they kind of lean consistently.
So can't the results like be kind of skewed then, like depending on like what the state has like for voting procedures? 'Cause, like we're like semi-closed, so
Yeah.
we have to like we have the ability to register independent.
Right.
So then like
Does
wouldn't
that
kind
skew
of
the,
mess it
does that
up?
skew the kind of like, are
The
you,
statistics?
are you an independent because you're more looking to do that rating and you
Yeah.
really are a more staunch Democrat or Republican? Yeah, so those numbers are kind of skewed. It also is kind of skewed in the sense of these are national averages, but we have the, we go state by state with a winner-take-all system. So what often matters more is what are the numbers state by state, rather than that national average, because you can't totally use this. If this was consistent, then you would say as long as the Democrats show up, they should win every time, right? But that's not the case. So yeah, there are things that definitely skew the numbers. But what I want to point out is that that's a big pool to go after, and they lean fairly consistently, but maybe there's something that you can do to kind of knock them in one direction or the other. So you're going to have this, like I said, this scientific, systematic approach to running a campaign, starting with key individuals that you ought to be able to identify and describe and illustrate what they do, just like you ought to be able to describe like White House staff and committees and things like that. We want to be able to get to the specifics. You don't want to just talk in generalities without the right terminology. So there are media or campaign specialists. They're the ones that come up with the narrative, the story. What I'm really struck by is a lot of what they're doing is figuring out how to capitalize on the technology of the day, and that plays a kind of an amazing role in determining elections. Now, start with trains and whistle stops. You went from kind of front porch campaigns where someone would literally kind of, give a speech off at their front porch and the newspapers would carry it. So I suppose newspapers there being also kind of a technology, to them traveling and stopping at whistle stops. The one that mastered kind of travel in the train had a decided advantage in that election. And so just kind of keep carrying it forward. The radio, television. What was, with television, what's the famous kind of example that shows you how important of a role television played and the person that was better able to master it?
Was it JFK?
Yeah, running against, who didn't look good on TV? So JFK looked Nixon, right? So what's funny is I think if you were to watch it today, I don't know if you'd get the same read. Black and white, Kennedy, reportedly went ahead and I don't know if it was makeup or whatever, but Nixon was reported to be kind of sweaty, he looked pale, he looked kind of shifty and uncomfortable in front of the camera.
Having pale and black and white.
Yeah, that's, well, again, you'd have kind of those monotones would be kind of more exaggerated, right? So I don't always see it when I watch it. I don't know if it's like someone's put the preconceived notion in my head, but Kennedy came across better on TV, and a lot of people credit that's how come he won.
This is kind of off topic,
Yeah.
but is a beeper a answering machine?
So no, a beeper is really kind of funny. It's and I listed there just to show you almost the absurdity. So it used to be everyone just kind of had wall phones, right? And how do I reach you if you're not at home, right? Well, for a while there was a pager, a beeper. And it would ring and there'd be a buzz and there would be a number, and then I had to go find a phone to call somebody, okay? What essentially Clinton did was kind of a very skillful use of beeper to kind of alert the press to certain stories to get it into the news cycle as they wanted it. So I kind of point out some absurd technologies that turn out to be more important than you would think. Now, social media and Twitter is probably the next frontier of sorts, right? What's interesting about that is, what does it bypass? This is what I think you have to understand about social media and why it is effective. What does it bypass, Paul?
So going back to the beeper thing, like you used to have to be in contact with news
Right,
organizations. So
almost every single one of them, you're going through them as a medium.
Yeah, but With Twitter, you can just do it yourself.
right? So this is kind of a way to get your news directly to the people that you want in an unfiltered form.
Like if I open up Twitter right now, not that I use Twitter, but like I could find like Donald Trump's most recent tweet and be like,
Yep.
this could be foreign policy for all I know.
It's, and essentially, what I'm struck by is, I'm not even gonna describe this well, but how bots are used to, like if there's an algorithm where if certain terminology pops up, the bots are kind of programmed to make like a comment to it. And it's not so much, I mean, it may sound like gibberish in terms of what the bots are doing, but it alerts every other kind of Twitter user to go to that site and then make more legitimate concepts or comments. It's a way to kind of bring attention to it, and the whole idea is like politics have become about like thumbs up and likes, and how many kind of followers and things like that. So there's even that sophistication going on about like you need people to do the algorithms that get you the traffic that you're looking for. Colin.
It's kind of insane. It is kind of insane how many bots there are, because like I have like a notification pop up whenever Donald Trump tweets.
Yep.
And you click on it and someone's already typed like an essay.
Right.
It's gotta be a bot.
And so again, some of that is artificially generated as well.
Yeah, I've got, so like just for example, like this
Yeah.
is, you know, history class. Our founders invoked our creator 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. Our currency declares, in all caps, in God we trust. And we place our hands on our hearts to be recite the Pledge of Allegiance and proclaim that we are one nation under God, # National Prayer Breakfast.
Is that real? Or is that a bot?
That's at real, that's the at real Donald Trump. So I mean, you know, I mean at this point you can't, it's hard to.
Okay, so that just sounded like word salad, but I get what you're, I get that there's a bunch of kind of hashtags or other things that increase the traffic and kind of get people into the feed. Now, another kind of thing that we'll look at in a second is some of what that social media does is also get picked up by the mainstream media. So you go ahead and put out a provocative kind of, you know, tweet, and the mainstream media kind of repeats it. Now you're getting, and you'll see a chart in a little bit, what I think Trump was fairly genius about, you get essentially unearned or free media. And you're gonna see some statistics on that, right? For some, any news is good news, or any publicity is good publicity. There's no such thing as bad publicity, and if you're getting kind of people talking about you, that's a good thing. The key too, though, is can you spin it? So there are people that are actually masters of spin. That's again, key terminology that you might look at, where you're, an event has happened, and now I want to kind of put our own spin on it. Kellyanne Conway, kind of famous with when you know, Trump had kind of stated what had seemed like a complete inaccuracy about the inaugural crowds and the size of it. Does anybody remember what she famously said? That he's just putting out what kind of facts?
Alternative facts.
Alternative facts. That is a kind of genius spin, don't you think?
Until you get
He's
caught
not
lying.
wrong. He's not. It's just. He's not wrong. He's not mistaken. It's an alternative fact. That is.
How is
That is an amazing example of spin.
The like the alternative facts. I don't know if you saw this, but people found that the same day that the alternative facts controversy started, book sales for 1984 tripled.
Yep.
I'm glad people are brushing up before making those references.
It. What do they call it in 1984? Something speak.
Double think.
Yes.
Double thing.
So this is just a little quick clip to, like, after every debate, after every kind of appearance, there are these people that are sent out to get in front of the cameras and essentially say, no, we did a good job on that. And I think people will appreciate this, or he didn't mean that, this is what he meant. So this is just a kind of quick clip to show you what I mean by you need media specialists. You need someone who's good at spin.
And the spin room is a place that sort of sits just adjacent to the debate stage, and all of the media sort of descends upon it after the debate's over.
What the spin room does is let you come, and first you go through the exercise of declaring your candidate the victor and why they were brilliant. You feel like you won.
Well, I don't know whether I won or not. I made my point. I did fine. I enjoyed it very much. You never quite know how you do until you get the feedback.
I think Rand Paul did a very fine. He did very well. I think Governor Christie was very strong tonight. I think he won the debate hands down. Senator Cruz was by far the most searched name on the internet.
People think that what happens on the stage at the debate is the most important thing. That's probably not true anymore. It's what happens on social, and what happens in the news, the next day, the day after that, the day after that.
The thing about the spin room is it just doesn't really matter anymore now that you have Twitter. The only time I think the spin room really matters is if a candidate just flubs something entirely. And perhaps the best example of this is Rick Perry back in 2012, the infamous oops moment.
It's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see. Oops.
After he found out he came to the spin room himself, and he talked to reporters and said,
Yeah, I stepped in it, man. Yeah, it was embarrassing. Of course it was.
You're not going to eliminate the fun of the spin room. Everything is an evolution. Roosevelt found the radio, Kennedy found network TV, Bill Clinton found cable TV, and Obama found social media. Now everybody's using everything.
All right, so kind of like,
Third thing.
I can't remember which was
I
the
think it was
third
Department of
department.
Energy, which he's now the head of.
That's concerning.
That would be a very big
You need, yeah, that'd be a big oops. You need to fact check. I don't think it was energy, but I don't know if it was interior, I forget what.
Hang on, I'm gonna give that a
Yeah, give it a quick look. All right, so what else do you need? Well, you need pollsters. You guys have gone through that exercise where you looked at particular demographic groups and what they kind of, where they typically lean. And you can see how you start drilling down on it. What issues are important to them? Where do they stand on these issues and why? So the pollster is the person that can begin to come up with your overall kind of game plan, your strategy.
Right? It was the energy department.
It was energy.
He's now the head of it, and he couldn't remember
Oh,
what it was
yeah.
called.
That should have stood out to me more. Notice terminology, guys, here, and the image that goes with it. The problem with pollsters are they're incredibly important, obviously. You need the numerics to kind of come up. You have limited time, you have limited resources, you have 50 states to kind of tackle. You better have a strategy for it. And a lot of times it unfortunately comes down to, like I said, identity politics, these big sweeping generalizations about what particular demographic groups want, and you kind of push and pull those, push those buttons and pull those levers. From the media standpoint, what it devolves into is kind of a horse race, where we focus on the numbers, and the numbers become more important than the actual issues or substance of a kind of a campaign. We're not looking at issues, we're not looking at the substance of a candidate and what they're qualified for. We're going with the numbers. Why? Because numbers are what? Simple, right? And literally some papers will illustrate it as a, a physical horse race. Some of that, I suppose, is a necessary evil because you need data. The media is market driven, and this is a simple thing to kind of sell newspapers. Often we think of them as having a ideological bias, and certain outlets maybe certainly lean left and right, and some far left and far right. But by and large, the mainstream media is just market driven. If they have a bias, it's to selling papers. And so when they have a whole scope of stories to tell, which ones do they tell? And it's the ones that generate clicks or subscriptions, okay? Also, we emphasize the numbers because the numbers, build that momentum. That's the other rule of politics, right? What else do I need? I need fundraising experts. In the most recent presidential elections, Hillary spent almost like $1.5 billion. Trump was close to $1 billion. We're talking over $2 billion that needs to be kind of, and did they use matching funds? Did they go through the public kind of funding system? No, they could raise more themselves independently. So that is huge, especially when you look at who tends to outspend who? Incumbents or challengers? Incumbents spend more. Who wins more often? Incumbents, right? Is there potentially a correlation between how much you spend and how likely it is that you win?
Yes.
We're going to look at some charts and graphs that might further kind of prove that. Notice the difference here. You would need potentially both district campaign managers and campaign managers. The distinction being, I am running a 50-state kind of campaign. I want managers that are geographically based, that can essentially organize my ground game. That tends to be another rule of politics. On some level, my media strategy allows me to kind of do this universal remote kind of campaign, but is there any substitute for being on the ground, knowing what the people in that state care about, having an ability to go knock on doors, that's called canvassing, having an ability to kind of set up a phone bank where people are called on a nightly basis. Is there any substitute for that? Most people are kind of reluctant to get to the polls. Is this a way to kind of get them informed, get them motivated, and get them to the polls, even if you're volunteering to drive them, which in a lot of cases they do, right? So this usually is a major factor, and then your campaign manager is kind of like a parallel for what eventually is your chief of staff. You need, again, candidate is got some tremendous drains on them in terms of their resources. You need a buffer, you need a filter. You need someone that essentially is pointing the candidate where they need to go and what they need to do, right? That's also why, again, the chief of staff is important.
I know there's like a minuscule sample size, but do you know what the incumbency rate is for presidents?
You would have to look at how often someone wins a second term, right? As the kind of the model for that. I don't have a number. I'm not willing to kind of risk a number off of that, but I would say that the incumbent president typically has an advantage. It's unusual for a person to kind of lose. You know, we talk about Carter, we talk about Ford, in terms of modern presidents. Well, the ones that are one-termers. Lyndon Johnson, I don't know if you put him in the mix because he decided not to run. So I would say that, you know, the incumbent president wins the majority of the time, you know, versus the challenger. You'd have to have something kind of profound like, you know, economic upheaval typically would be kind of a catalyst, all right? Again, see if you can multitask. I've got, you know, my fact checkers researching in real time. All right, so yeah. Yep, so one of the things that you want to see is your campaign media specialist. You know, they're trying to make sure that you are likable, they're trying to craft the story, but they come up with the overall media campaign. And again, here's terminology, because that's what keeps political scientists and AP teachers employed. They're going to come up with their kind of media strategy, and it includes picking what type of ads. You know, if we're running a campaign of hope, well then maybe I kind of go all positive. I'm going to skew positive. That's an easy one to define, right? Positive ads are uplifting, upbeat, not negative. I probably define it that way, that don't kind of, you know, do the negative kind of mudslinging, and then I define negative as not positive, you know, emphasizing kind of flaws and a more pointed criticism.
So of the past, according to this, so this article came out in 2012.
Yep.
And it says that in the past 10 presidential elections, the incumbent has won 7 times.
7 times.
So it looks somewhere
70%.
like 7 times.
Yeah.
70%.
In total, it's 15 out of 42 who won a second term.
15 out of 42, but the,
Lately, it's more, right?
well, yeah, it depends on what kind of, you know, we've got number 45 in right now. Wherever, that's the thing with statistics. I can make the number whatever I want based on, you know, what my sampling is.
And the FDR kind of throws a monkey wrench into the operation.
Right, right. So I think you'd have to do a little more systematic look as to, you know, what it is case by case and which ones am I putting in my sampling size, which ones am I taking out. All right, so positive ads. Here's a couple of examples. Doesn't mention the other person, isn't really, you know, it's maybe vague, it's not maybe issue specific, but it is positive. More terminology, you know, television and internet kind of time is expensive, and often you just want to kind of saturate. It doesn't have to be a lengthy commercial. In fact, our attention spans aren't built for that, right? So what you can see is like spot ads, and spot ads are literally 10, 30, or 60 seconds long, just to kind of get that information out there, all right? In contrast, there's a negative ad, all right? So is this an ad for Harry Reid? No. It's against Harry Reid. And the question is, you know, are negative ads, you know, not to define the thing with the thing, but are they negative? In other words, are they bad for politics? Are you getting information about Harry Reid? Potentially here. Is it information?
Yeah.
Yeah, on some level. You know, whether it's factual, you'd have to kind of do some research for, but there's a couple of things that speak to negative ads and why they're used why they're used to the degree that they're used, because they're used to a very high degree. You're going to see that in some charts in a second. One, they are informational. Two, they seem to work, right? We do seem to respond to them. Question?
I was gonna say, if you had like the best example of an attack ad. Oh, nice.
All right, so here we go. Quick question.
I feel like if you use negative ads, like voters focus more on like the bad things that in the country.
Sure. I mean, that is maybe kind of toxic and you can begin to associate that with the candidate, that the candidate is negative, and is that presidential. But in general, you're going to see some ads here in a second that work. They're pretty effective.
Eisenhower answers America.
The Democrats have made mistakes, but aren't their intentions good?
Well, if the driver of your school bus runs into a truck, hits a lamppost, drives into a ditch, you don't say his intentions are good. You get a new bus driver.
That's from TV.
Step right up, folks. See the mental marvel of the campaign, Mr. GOP. He promises to solve all your problems. Ask him any question.
What about Korea?
We don't belong in Korea. Let the commies have it.
We should expand the war. Open a second front in China. Wait a minute. We can't do both. We can't pull our troops out of Korea and invade China.
Go away, lady. You bother me. Any more questions?
At the same press conference, President Eisenhower said,
No one can make a decision except me.
and as for any major ideas from Mr. Nixon,
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
President Eisenhower could not remember, but the voters will remember. For real leadership in the 60s, help elect Senator John F. Kennedy president.
This is one of the most famous ones.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
So McGovern was considered
The stakes are too
unstable,
high for you to
didn't want his
stay
finger
home.
on the nuclear button.
How can a party that can't unite itself unite the nation? How can a party that can't keep order in its own backyard hope to keep order in our 50 states?
This is about secrecy. This is about stealing. This is about hidden funds. This is about deception. This is about the White House. And this is how you stop it. With your vote.
I just can't imagine him being president. It's too complex a job.
When I go into the polling booth on November 4th, I'm not just going to think of the politics. I got to think of my family.
Two men are the real contenders for the presidency today. The people of California remember one of them quite well.
Ronald Reagan is not a man that I would want leading our country for any period of time.
I deeply, deeply resent and am offended by the attacks that President Carter has made on my husband, the personal attacks that he's made on my husband.
So a negative ad about
He is
negative
not
ads.
a warmonger. He is not a man who was going to throw the elderly out on the street and cut out their Social Security. That's a terrible thing to do and to say about anybody. That's campaigning on fear.
Now Ronald Reagan says the economy is moving up. It is. Up on a mountain of debt and record Reagan deficits. More globally than all the other presidents in history combined. That'll drive interest rates up, slow the economy down. And then, if you're thinking of voting for Ronald Reagan in 1984, think of what'll happen in 1985.
Add 26 cents to a loaf of bread if Carter Mondale's inflation continued. Add 34 cents to milk. $1.28 to a pound of bacon. If that doesn't convince you to vote for President Reagan, stop off at the gas station and imagine paying $2.27 a gallon.
The caucus opposed the stealth bomb, a ground emergency warning system against the attack.
This
He
killed
even
more
criticized our rescue
caucus
mission
because he
to
looked
Grenada
ridiculous
and our
driving the
strike
tank
on
around.
Libya. And now he wants to be our commander-in-chief. America can't afford that risk.
Hey, pal, how about a couple $100 billion? I'll pay you right back.
This is what the Republicans call managing the economy.
Hey, pal, $500 billion, just to kind of get me over the hump.
They should call it mortgaging our children's future. He says he wouldn't rule out term limits, while he says he's personally opposed to term limits. This candidate was called up for military service, while this one claims he wasn't. One of these candidates is Bill Clinton. Unfortunately, so is the other. The George Bush promise.
Read my lips.
Famous soundbite.
Then he gave us the second biggest tax increase in American history. Bush increased the gas tax by 56%. Can we afford 4 more years? Bill Clinton, a different kind of Democrat.
Bill Clinton never took the drug crisis seriously.
If you had to do this over again, would you inhale? Sure, if I could. I tried before.
You know the result. Under Clinton's liberal policies, teen drug use has doubled. But now Clinton admits he was wrong.
I wish I'd never done any of that. Although I did such a little bit, but it was wrong.
Kerry voted for the Iraq War, opposed it, supported it, and now opposes it again. He bragged about voting for the $87 billion to support our troops before he voted against it. He voted for education reform and now opposes it. He claims he's against increasing Medicare premiums, but voted 5 times to do so. John Kerry, whichever way the wind kills us. 1,000 U.S. casualties. 2 Americans beheaded just this week. The Pentagon admits terrorists are pouring into Iraq. In the face of the Iraq quagmire, George Bush's answer is to run a juvenile and tasteless attack ad. John Kerry has a plan for success.
That seems odd.
He's the biggest celebrity in the world. But is he ready to lead? With gas prices soaring, Barack Obama says no to offshore drilling and says he'll raise taxes on electricity.
Wonder where John McCain would take the economy? Look behind you. John McCain wants to continue George Bush's economic policies. As president, he'd provide no tax breaks to 101 million Americans, but keep tax breaks for companies that ship our jobs overseas.
But on July 12th, President Obama quietly announced a plan to gut welfare reform by dropping work requirements. Under Obama's plan, you wouldn't have to work and wouldn't have to train for a job. They just send you your welfare check. And welfare to work goes back to being plain old welfare. Mitt Romney will restore the work requirement because it works.
You work hard, stretch every penny, but chances are you pay a higher tax rate than him. Mitt Romney made $20 million in 2010, but paid only 14% in taxes, probably less than you. Now he has a plan that would give millionaires another tax break.
You can't escape them. You just can't escape them.
So, again, they're negative, but did you get information? And it's incumbent on you to kind of, figure out how valid it is. A couple of quick thoughts. Again, I was talking, that one ad, that particularly provocative one where the girl is picking the kind of the petals off the daisy, and then you have the nuclear cloud. That is LBJ, and it is Barry Goldwater. I think I said McGovern. Barry Goldwater was an arch conservative and thought to be, scary and to the right, and that he was going to, he was not stable enough to have kind of the control of nuclear weapons, and that's the ad that they went with. You saw a lot of themes of double, politicians talking out both sides of their head, flip-floppers. And that's like, a great one to kind of land on somebody, that you're a flip-flopper, that you don't have clear ideological positions that are consistent. On the other hand, you want someone who's ideologically rigid and never changes their mind. So it's kind of interesting how, again, as Americans, we kind of want insiders and outsiders. We want people that evolve in their political positions but are ideologically consistent. We're Americans. We're free to pick and choose and be completely, inconsistent in our consistencies. So in a second here, I'll talk about what an inoculation ad is. But again, look at those numbers. That you're seeing the vast majority in this kind of sampling, 87% of the ads to 13% were negative to positive. Again, you kind of see by candidate in the dark blue there, the percent of negative ads that they tended to run. One of the things that you can do is, give information by doing what's called a contrast ad. See if I have enough time for this. So it's negative, but it's also presenting, here's what this other guy is doing. He's a jerk. Here's why I'm a good guy. You kind of show two sides with a bias to one of the sides. Put it in the wrong spot.
Cory Booker said he would clean up city government if it worked. But by his own admission, 19 members of his administration have been convicted of corruption charges, including his deputy mayor. Is this a leader whose judgment we can trust? As U.S. Attorney, Chris Christie convicted over 100 public officials on corruption charges. Chris Christie believes in putting corrupt officials in prison, not in his cabinet.
All right, so contrast. And then
He also, it was Chris Christie who did the gridlock thing, right?
Bridgegate.
Bridgegate, and
Yeah.
that got someone killed. Because they were in an ambulance and they couldn't get through. And I think they died in the ambulance.
Again, I might need some fact checking on that as to whether or not that's something kind of erroneously reported or not, but supposedly campaign aides did, in order to kind of, as a little retribution in New Jersey, do some road closure, and it certainly probably would have, it could have obviously potentially impacted that.
Oh yeah, I got it right here. It was, it's so New York Daily News. It was when it happened, like at least like when that lockdown did happen,
Yep.
there was a 91-year-old woman in an ambulance who was
Okay.
dying.
Yes.
And she was being rushed, and they just didn't make it.
They didn't make it.
The family didn't blame Christie because she was very old.
Gotcha.
She was gonna make it anyway.
So didn't help.
Right. Yeah, it probably didn't help.
All right.
Was it also
So
Chris Christie who shut down the beach just so he
yeah, they had budget cuts within New Jersey, and it meant essentially beaches were without lifeguards, and therefore the beaches were closed down, but he and his family went. And so that was really bad optics.
Yes.
But he was,
When he hugged Obama, that murdered him for some reason.
well, yeah, again,
He stays underwater, and Obama gives him a hug.
and he was seen as saying, I appreciate the president for the aid they brought during Hurricane Harvey. I think it was Harvey. All right, real quick, because I'm running out of time, I want to show you an inoculation ad. So what does that sound like?
Stop the bleeding before it starts.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, they got dirt on me. Let me get ahead of this. Let me do a flu shot, right?
Since I've been in Washington, I've made a lot of people angry. I made defense contractors angry when I blew the whistle on a $30 billion boondoggle and the culprits were sent to jail. I upset the special interests and Washington lobbyists when I passed campaign finance reform. I made the Pentagon angry when I criticized Rumsfeld's Iraq strategy. And I upset the media when I supported the strategy that's now succeeding. I angered the big spenders in Congress when I called for earmark and spending reform. No more $233 million bridges to nowhere, or $74 million for peanut storage and a defense spending bill. I didn't go to Washington to win the Mr. Congeniality Award. I went to Washington to serve my country. I might not like the business as usual crowd in Washington, but I love America. I love her enough to make some people angry. I'm John McCain, and I approve this message.
All right, so he knew what the knock was going to be against him, and he gets ahead of it and basically takes a negative and makes it into a positive. This was the chart that I was telling you about how you just basically use Twitter, use provocative comments to get free or unearned media. That's another strategy. I don't think I'll have a lot of time here, but can you divine in the last, nanoseconds here the impact of debates? Here is a pre-debate poll. Here is the election result. Pre-debate poll, election result. So I'm seeing lines moving, but what am I not seeing?
Lines going down?
Let's do it this way. Clinton and Bush, who won? Clinton, okay. Hey, fantastic.
Jeopardy?
Yeah, well, we're doing We're using all kinds of technology here. You're on recording. We'll say hi to Charlie. That's
You can't. He's here.
He's there.
Okay.
And we're just kind of sending him what we're going over today.
Do you want to do this tomorrow? I can replace you.
I am doing this block, so we flip flop, so I can do it.
Yeah, but there's two different things you have to do.
Hold on. Let me. All right. Say goodbye to Charlie.
Bye, Charlie.
I don't need.